Kako si bre? This phrase means how are you in informal Serbian, combining the word how and the second person singular form of the verb to be. However, the third word, bre, defies translation into English, although it is extremely common, not just in Serbian, but in almost every language variant and dialect in the Balkans, regardless of language family. The most approximate English equivalent would probably be the personal pronoun you or a noun like man, dude, or bro. However, none of that fully covers all the meanings and functions because bre is neither a personal pronoun nor a noun, but a specific type of interjection called a vocative or expressive particle. Vocative particles appear in many languages around the world. An internationally somewhat known example is che in Argentinian Spanish. The Dutch language also has a particle, yo, which works in the same way. A defining feature of these interjections is that they only have a second person form. That is, they are only used when addressing someone or something, often in an exclamation, and regularly ending up replacing elements like hey, oh, or wow. What makes these particles in the languages of the Balkans so interesting is their particular richness in terms of both frequency of use and variation. Each language has its own set of different particles. According to one account, for example, there are 56 different discernible forms of vocative particles in the Greek language alone, when considering all regional variants and pronunciations. The use of a particular particle hinges on a number of factors like social relationship between speakers, gender, dialect, folkloric or poetic symbolism, or emotional state. And, depending on the context and the particle, their meaning can range from respect and intimacy to extreme offensiveness. Roughly speaking, Balkanic expressive particles can be divided in two classes, bre and more, or B particles and M particles. To start, bre and its different variants are used across southeastern Europe in colloquial speech when addressing people, most often but certainly not exclusively men, and appear also in languages outside the Balkans like Assyrian, the Cypriot Greek dialect, and Ukrainian. A paper written by Anu Vastenius at the University of Lund, Sweden, suggests that the particle originally might have derived from the Kurdish language, where bre or bra just means brother, but the writer admits that more research is needed. The Romanian dictionary lists the etymology of bre as Turkish, which means it arrived during Ottoman times, although it wouldn't surprise me either if it is something even older than that, because of how ingrained it is in the language. Let's look at a selection of the most common bre-type particles for 5 different Balkan languages. As we can see, the generic form bre appears in all 5 of them, but each language also has a shorter version, be. Serbians are known to prefer bre, but in Bulgarian the shorter be form is much more common. My Bulgarian sources have also told me about other variants, like abe, and the even more bastardized form, aue, which I've included here too. Another interesting fact to note is that in Greek, where the B sounds in the language have transformed into V sounds over the course of centuries, many people, instead of bre, use vre, or simply re. Here are some examples of phrases using these B particles. Bulgarian, be, varni se. Romanian, bă, stai un pic. Now for the second category of vocative particles, more and its different forms, the M particles. These words are said to originally derive from Greek moros, meaning idiot, but as particles they are generally speaking a somewhat less informal form of bre. However, its use and connotation is sometimes quite different. Regularly found in folkloric songs and texts, M particles can take on a much more poetic character than bre or be, and are not only exclaimed against persons, but also against impersonal concepts like a nation, a landscape feature, or even a feeling. Here is an oversight of some of the M particles in the 5 languages. In most Balkan languages today, the use of M particles is more limited than the B particles in everyday speech, seen as old-fashioned or archaic. Although there is a difference between urban and rural environments, and there are exceptions to this trend, as I will point out in a bit. Some languages or dialects distinguish between more, masculine, and moi or mori, feminine, or sometimes plural. Some examples. Bulgarian, Къде ходиш, море брате? Albanian, Rosh moj kunga labe. Romanian, Măi dorule măi. To recap, bre particles, as a general rule, are informal and can be perceived as quite rude, and more particles, as a general rule, are slightly less informal, but often seen as old-fashioned or sometimes as poetic or folkloric. I want to zoom in now a bit to the Romanian language to show in more detail the different social and cultural connotations of its vocative particles. I will start with the less impolite ones, moving towards increasingly informal and even rude particles. First, the forms mere, mări, are very archaic and mostly obsolete. I haven't encountered these ever, although who knows, maybe somewhere on the countryside they might still be heard. The same cannot be said about the variant măi, which is much more common. A frequently encountered example is in traditional art, where it can have a more respectful or poetic connotation, like in the already presented example măi dorule măi, a common phrase heard in folk songs. Here the particle is used to address a feeling, but măi is also employed when addressing people, even in daily speech. Romanian is actually the exception that I alluded to before, because unlike in most other Balkan languages, M particles are a normal part of everyday informal interactions, in both rural and urban environments, calling on one or multiple people, men as well as women. Măi frate, de ce pleci? Măi fetelor, veniți la masă. Sometimes the vowel sound can also change, so you hear something that sounds more like mui or me. Now, the variant m is used in almost identical ways. However, I would say less for folkloric abstractions and more in daily speech for addressing people. Again, sometimes the sound changes to m or me, etc. I would place m in a slightly more informal category as compared to mui. This also counts for other particles that I am about to list, ending with a type of schwa sound, u. Ce faci, mă? Dă-te, mă, dracu. Moving now to the Romanian B particles. Please note that whereas M particles are already informal and can signal a degree of closeness or intimacy, but also impoliteness when used in the wrong setting, once you enter B particle territory, you descend into an even lower scale of informality. The use of these vocative particles can actually cause offense, even sometimes among friends or acquaintances, although they are still extremely common in everyday Romanian, more often among men than women. The generic form bre is found in many regions of the country, but it is certainly more rural than urban. In major cities like Bucharest, one more often hears the variant băi, or without the final I, bă, which I consider again slightly more impolite. Bă, vino încoa! Here, similar vowel changes as with the M particles can occur, and in the eastern Romanian region of Moldavia, a common variant is ui or ui. Ce faci, ui? And there's more. If we look a second again at the Bulgarian M particles, we see the form ma, which in that language is used exclusively to address women in a very rural or very low-class setting, and is overall seen as very rude. Romanian also has such a concept, but in the Romanian case, it forms its own distinct class of particles, which I will call F particles, namely fui, fa, and, the worst of all, f. The different forms of F particles are not simply the feminine equivalents of the B particles, and stating that they hit the rock bottom of informality does not even begin to describe their negative connotation. Although common in some parts of the deep countryside and among certain social classes, like in the Bulgarian case, the general Romanian population views fui-like particles as extremely offensive, on par with the most shocking and obscene profanity, of which the language also has a great wealth, and which is often used in combination with them. I would advise against ever using F particles in real life, not even as a joke, except perhaps against a female dog, because that's one of the things it means. Here are some examples. Fă, tâmpito, n-ai ochi în cap! When your taxi driver narrowly avoids crashing into a woman's car. Or one might also encounter F particles with an alternative vowel sound, like when you hear an intoxicated homeless couple arguing on the streets of Bucharest. Fă, dă-mi banii înapoi! Although I've listed all Romanian vocative particles that I'm aware of, there are probably plenty of regional variants and different pronunciations that I have missed, and that counts definitely for all the other languages, of which I've only scratched the surface. We have seen that these simple and often monosyllabic particles can have a wide and fascinating range of meanings and functions in the Balkans, from poetic and folkloric, intimate and familiar, to impolite, rude, and extremely offensive. In these languages, including Romanian, vocative particles are often accompanied by nouns and proper names that take on the so-called vocative case, and many of the examples that I have presented used that grammatical case, which merits further attention, but perhaps on another occasion. I hope you found this an interesting oversight, and before ending my talk, I will leave you with some bonus vocative particles, namely those for Aromanian, or Vlach, which is a small Eastern Romance language, or some would say a set of Romanian dialects, spoken in the southern Balkans, mainly in Greece, Albania, and North Macedonia, and by Aromanians whose ancestors moved to Romania or other countries. Besides the already discussed forms like More, Mori, Moi, and Bre, Aromanian, or Armenește, also has its very own distinct vocative particle, which is on the same level of informality and intimacy as the M particles in Romanian, is widely used in both folklore and everyday informal speech, and has both a masculine and a feminine variant, which are both equally common, lui for men and la for women. Some examples to wrap it up. Ți-a dar lei? La imșata mea. And o lui munta în altul.